Okay, class, the word of the day is self-sabotage.
What?
No, all right. I know that sounds bad.
Hi, I'm Krona the Harlequin, and welcome back to Live from the Black Library, where today I want to talk to you about just the dumbest lore change in a long time. And of course, I'm talking about the recent confirmation as to what the Terminus Decree actually is. But before we get into it, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, and consider supporting me on Patreon if you want to help me make these videos even faster, and consider joining my Discord server linked down below to keep up with me and everything I've got going on. So once again, thank you for your support, and without further ado, let's get into the new Terminus Decree. Now, for those who don't know, the Terminus Decree is essentially a secret order hidden in the deepest chambers on Titan, the fortress moon under the control of and sequestered for the use of the Grey Knights and the Grey Knights alone, them being a very secretive chapter, which is kept secret from the Imperium because their entire reason for existing is to combat demons wherever they may be. In fact, one of the only groups that knows about the Grey Knights is the Inquisition, because they are the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, the oldest arm of the Inquisition. Their origins actually date back to the very end of the Horus Heresy, right before the Siege of Terra began. You see, what happened was, after Malcador gathered several loyal Marines who were only under his command for covert operations called the Knights Errant, many of them hailing from legions that had now turned traitor, some of them would eventually survive the heresy, and those among them that were psychically active would be teleported to Titan in order for them to begin creating their secret order that would be needed to fight the coming wars and battles with Chaos and the Warp in the future if the Siege of Terra was won. And some of these people would include Tylos Rubio, the Ultramarine Librarian, the Nemean, who was a Dark Angel that went rogue and tried to establish his own empire, but left his fellows in disgust before being picked up, Fel Zarost, a loyalist Night Lord's librarian who had been marked for death by his fellows, most notably Sevatar, and ran back to Terra, Janus, a surviving Thousand Sun sorcerer who was nearly used by Malcador as a host for the Shard of Goodness of Magnus the Red that was still on Terra, as well as several others, one of which was actually meant to be Garvia Loken, but he declined, instead opting to stay on Terra and continue the fight alongside others like Nathaniel Garrow. And on Titan, which was actually hidden away inside the warp itself because that's where Horus would never think to look, they would find an entire monastery and hundreds of recruits for them to start training, and a stockpile of Gene Seed, which is not one of the Primarchs but is actually the Emperor himself. It is here they would hone their psychic abilities and their craft in killing demons, gathering as much information as they could about them, and then eventually form into the first ever Space Marine chapter, that being a cohort of Space Marines exactly 1,000 strong, just like all other Space Marine chapters would be modeled on after the second founding. From then on, the Grey Knights would have a very rich and unique history, engaging in several clandestine campaigns, establishing, of all things, very good relations with the Eldari, specifically the Asuryani, and even on occasion the Harlequins according to some lore, and keeping their existence a secret no matter how many people they have to kill in order to keep that secret. Oftentimes, these people are innocent civilians or guardsmen who fought alongside them thinking they were just normal Space Marines. And they would do this because if you know about the Grey Knights, that means you know about demons. And in their mind, anyone knowing about demons other than the proscribed small group of people is an existential threat to all of humanity, because when you know about demons, that's how they can get into your head and manifest into the real world through you. So, they will just kill anyone who might know about demons at all. However, in some cases, this has actually proven to be very, very difficult. And bear with me, I'm going somewhere with this. One example of this being the incident called the Months of Shame, whereupon, after the First War for Armageddon, in which Angron and the World Eaters manifested on the surface of the planet, but would be driven off by a combined force including the Guardsmen of the World, the Space Wolves, and the Grey Knights. However, after this, to be sure, the Grey Knights would want to condemn the entire human population of Armageddon, or at least the ones who had been fighting alongside them, to either execution or sterilization and a life of sequestered forced labor while the planet would be resettled. and obviously the Space Wolves thought this was abhorrent. This disagreement would eventually culminate in a large-scale campaign between the Space Wolves and the Ordo Malleus, wherein the Grey Knights would effectively prove themselves to be nearly useless, with a Grand Master of their order being killed by Logan Grimnar. The Space Wolves would come out of this event known as the Months of Shame on top, and the Grey Knights would need to withdraw, and permit the Space Wolves to actually know about them, one of the few groups in the galaxy to actually have that knowledge outside of the Ordo Malleus. Also, much of their secret has been blown ever since the opening of the Great Rift, because with that, it's really hard to keep demons a proper secret from the wider Imperium. Basically, most of the army knows that there's something along the lines of demons. You just can't hide that anymore. So, what are the Grey Knights even doing, aside from just being particularly good at killing demons and able to advise others on how to kill demons? Because, you see, the Grey Knights are a holdover from some of the earlier stages of 40k lore, wherein demons were a fair bit rarer, and most Space Marines wouldn't even encounter them properly, or even if they did, they would have to have their memories erased after the fact, and humans who encountered demons would need to be executed. However, the lore has changed a fair bit since then, and now a fair amount of Space Marines are fighting demons on a semi-regular basis, and a lot of guardsmen have had to encounter them as well. Honestly, the last thing we see of a Grey Knight that is notable in the main storyline is one serving as an attaché to Rabute Gilliman to advise him on anti-demon matters. That's it. It's not anything notable. So, what really puts them apart is the fact that they have clearance to do things and to utilize methods that anyone else in the Imperium would be instantaneously executed for. An example of this is summoning demons. And I'm not just talking about, say, creating a demon host in a moment of need like a radical inquisitor. I mean legitimately summoning demons. Like, one thing they did in the book Angron the Red Angel was summon a bunch of demons of Slanesh in order to sick them on the Conqueror's drive engines to slow the ship down. And the reason they wanted to do this was so that they could finish setting up their trap that they were laying for Angron for the past 600 years. And if successful, this trap would make it so that he could never again manifest in the material world. As you can imagine, this trap of theirs failed. Granted, they did manage to wound Angron and did try to pursue him, only for the leader of the expedition to be killed and the Grey Knights to withdraw. So they didn't do nothing, but still, they flubbed a 600-year-long plan and lost to the Months of Shame. It seems like every time we see these guys do something, they're getting bodied, and yet, they have been entrusted with one of the most important and secretive directives of the entire Imperium, basically humanity's equivalent of the Book of the Ranadandra, that being the Terminus Decree, which is a simple piece of parchment with one command written on it, and is only available to the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, at least under normal circumstances. But, given the opening of the Great Rift, apparently the current Grand Master, Kaldor Drago, seems to have made the other lesser Grand Masters of the Grey Knights privy to, at the very least, the existence of the Terminus Decree. And this is also important because it shows just why the new lore is incredibly stupid. You see, that lore that the Grey Knights are considering the Terminus Decree is from the 8th edition Codex, meaning it came out in 2017, so it's not that old. And what is on the Terminus Decree? Well, in the old lore, it was never confirmed. It was something that we were left to guess at and speculate about, which is something that I actually liked. It provides a level of mystery and keeps us guessing. It gives the Grey Knights a certain mystique that other factions won't have when all of what they have going on is an open book to us, the readers. Like, we know all about what's going on with the Dark Angels and the Fallen, sure, but even we didn't know what the Terminus Decree was. However, there were some very interesting theories, and some of them were very much corroborated by the lore. You see, what we do know for sure, or what we at least knew, was that once the decree was opened and put into motion by the Supreme Grand Master, it would either save mankind from certain defeat, or doom it, in order to basically deny humanity's death to whatever force is about to kill it. Basically, you can't fire humanity, we quit. Which is, by the way, not an entirely petty act, because it could save humanity from eternal damnation. Hence why it's now being considered with the opening of the Great Rift. Two prevailing theories about the Terminus Decree used to be that 1. It could summon some kind of force or entity that would defeat the enemies of mankind. However, that's very risky because something that powerful would obviously be incredibly dangerous. In my mind, it could be like the spirit of the Emperor made manifest on Earth, or at least in the material realm as an entity that would lead the charge. Or that 2, it was a special procedure to actually purge the warp of the Chaos Gods and all demonic life. However, you're probably wondering, if that's what it was, why don't they just do it now? Well, you see, something like that would again be incredibly risky and could possibly risk, I don't know, either empowering them or severing humanity's connection to the warp entirely, leaving them either dead or, at worst, as soulless husks, similar to the Necrons but without the metal bodies and immortality. However, neither of those theories had much merit, even though they were, generally speaking, at least considered by the community and fandom, because that was a big part of the fun of the Terminus Decree, speculating on what in God's name it could be. However, in more recent editions, we had gotten some kind of confirmation as to what it could possibly be, and that narrowed down to 2 possibilities. The first being from the Grey Knight's 5th edition codex, which released in 2011, which states, "The Terminus Decree. Deep within the Chambers of Purity, locked away in the chambers said to hold the tomb of the Sigillite himself, rests a simple wooden box, embellished with a golden seal. Within this box, written upon ancient parchment, is the instruction known only as the Terminus Decree. This artifact goes unrecorded in all the libraries of the Imperium, for it has been kept secret from all but the Supreme Grand Masters of the chapter. Only a Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights knows how to open the box, and he will do so only when all hope for the future of humanity seems lost. The Terminus Decree is the ultimate sanction of the Grey Knights, a secret so vast it could bring the Imperium to its knees, or save it in its darkest hour. The exact nature of the document is unknown, and the only clue to its contents lies in the box's golden seal. It is whispered that it is the exact match of another seal, found only in one place in all the Imperium's many scattered worlds, the Emperor's Golden Throne. So, given that, a lot of people speculated that the Terminus Decree was a procedure to shut down the Golden Throne. There is nothing to actually confirm that that's what it does, but it does make sense given the nature of the name, Terminus, as in to terminate. Furthermore, there is enough vagueness in this theory to keep us guessing as to if that's what it actually is, and if so, what would that really achieve? Could it be an all-or-nothing gamble, hoping that if the Emperor is taken off the Golden Throne by shutting it down, he might resurrect or ascend, essentially risking 90% chance humanity becomes absolutely screwed without the Emperor, and a 10% chance that maybe he comes back and saves the day? A gamble that would not be worth it in any circumstances other than the absolute most dire ones. Or, perhaps they know it would just kill him and the Emperor wouldn't come back. But if things really do get that bad, such as they did during, say, the Siege of Terra, they activate the Terminus Decree, which we know would lead to the destruction of Terra itself, the vital brain of the Imperium, and the destruction and shutdown of the Astronomicon, something that is absolutely vital for humanity to have interstellar travel through the warp, and without it, humanity would be plunged back into Old Night. This would essentially stop the Imperium of Man from falling into the wrong hands and just praying that humanity can find some way to survive without the Imperium. However, quite possibly knowing this would just lead to the slow extinction of humanity across the galaxy, aside from maybe a few lucky pockets, as the species was headed before the Emperor launched the Great Crusade, effectively letting humanity depart with its dignity as opposed to being dominated by a specific enemy forever. And again, this also fits with the name Terminus, because it would be terminating the Emperor and the Imperium itself. However, that is lore from 2011, and in January 30th of 2024, we got new lore about the Terminus Decree. However, it's not specifically stated to be about the Terminus Decree. You see, this comes from the book The End and the Death Volume 3, which I have finished recording my review and summary of, which I know a lot of you guys were waiting for part 2 of that video, but part 2 is now finished recording and it is basically 6 hours long. In any case though, what we do get is the fact that when Malkador sits on the Golden Throne, or right as he's about to I should say, he sends out psychic messages to all of his chosen, that being those mortal humans he's had working alongside him and his remaining knights errant, so that they can continue some vital tasks without him and essentially carry out his will. And one of the leading members of his chosen, one Khalid Hassan, would be given a directive called Terminus, and he would pass this directive onto another member of the Chosen named Zaranchek Xanthus. Now, what was this Terminus directive? Well, simply put, they were to collect Basilio Foe, a mad scientist who was one of the Emperor's earliest recurring enemies during the Unification Wars, who made biological horrors and was imprisoned in the Imperial dungeon. You see, he was going to be tasked with making a super weapon that would serve as a phage, which would wipe out all transhuman genetics in the galaxy once it thoroughly spread. So this would kill every Primarch and every Space Marine, and moreover obliterate them on the soul level. And he would in fact complete the weapon, but he would be killed after trying to escape. After this, and I'm omitting a lot of details here that are not relevant but still very important, because you really should watch my The End in the Death Volume 3 video when it comes out, eventually, Zaranchek Xanthus is speculating on what will be done with the Terminus Decree after the war is over, and he reasons they'll probably take it to Titan, because they're taking away all the information just in case. This is essentially what you could call cold confirmation, where something is not explicitly stated in plain English, but many of the details essentially confirm something without directly saying what it is. As of 2024, the Terminus Decree was almost certainly, but not 100%, stated to be a biological weapon that would destroy every transhuman in the galaxy with enough time, and also destroy their souls. So it makes sense that something like this, which pertains to the existence of Space Marines, would not be trusted in the hands of mortal humans, and would be given to the most trustworthy and incorruptible of all Space Marine groups, that being the Grey Knights, and also why it wouldn't be in the hands of the Adeptus Custodes, because they really don't care all that much about Space Marines or even like them very much. In fact, Malcador was specifically careful when making this Terminus code word request that it not fall into the hands of the Custodes, because he didn't want them holding all the cards when the dust settled in case it didn't need to be used. And considering that Basilio Foe was working in a sequestered laboratory, basically in a cobbled together fashion, it would make sense that the Terminus Decree would be written on just a piece of parchment. However, the word Terminus is actually just a normal word, and as such could apply to more than one thing. So, maybe more than one thing is called Terminus, and Zaranchek Xanthus was just wrong about them taking the phage to Titan, meaning that the shut off the throne theory could still hold some water. It's enough to give a very clear idea of what it could be, but not confirm anything outright. That's why it's a cold confirmation. However, this is where we get into the 10th edition leaks that have recently come out and has the entire community up in arms. Because it is a full confirmation in plain English what the Terminus Decree is. No ambiguity, no room for error, just plain and simple. And it's this. Held in a simple wooden box that only the Supreme Grand Master may open, the Terminus Decree details the Emperor's final command to the Grey Knights chapter. The Master of Mankind can never be allowed to leave the Golden Throne, either returned to life, reborn in another's body, or ascended as some kind of warp entity. And if he does, the Grey Knights must return him to his terrible duty. Indeed, they were created with the possibility of this event in mind, a task beyond the abilities of any other force in the Imperium. The decree offers no guidance on how such feats might be achieved, for it is neither a weapon nor a magic formula. Rather, the Grey Knights would themselves be the weapon on such a desperate day, one that would likely have to cut a path through the ranks of the Custodian, Guard, and many others to see its duty done. Now I'm gonna say this in plain English, since we're all just speaking plainly here. This is one of the stupidest things I've ever heard in my life. And I'm gonna start from the top. 1. How did the Emperor give this directive to the Grey Knights? He only ever spoke to them exactly one time before they were sent off to Titan, and that was to inspect them to see if Malcador had chosen the right people for the job, which they had. It was just for a minute, and it happens in the book The Buried Dagger. So when would he have given this order to them on a piece of paper? Because I don't know if you know this, but he was busy. I am legitimately convinced, wholeheartedly, that whoever wrote this piece of lore did not read any of the End in the Death books, because this idea that the Emperor knew he might possibly ascend from the Golden Throne one day as some kind of warp entity or reborn somehow is just not feasible. Did the Emperor and Malkador know that there was a chance he might end up permanently interred on the Golden Throne, doomed to an eternity of suffering? Yes, they did, and they had contingencies in place for just such an eventuality. But that was essentially Plan Z, or more like Plan Y. Plan Z would be to, take all of humanity with them. You see, after the plan to resurrect Magnus and have him take the throne failed, Malkador and the Emperor's expectation was that they would hold out long enough and pin Horus's forces down for just enough time for Guilliman, the Lion, Russ, and the entire Avenging Fleet to show up in their rear and make them fight a two-front war they could never win. However, as time wore on and this became unfeasible, long after the Grey Knights had departed to Titan and were now unreachable because they and the entire moon of Titan was sealed away in the warp, they settled on Plan Anabasis, which was for the Emperor and several of the Custodes, along with Sanguinius and several of his Blood Angels, to board the Vengeful Spirit and assault Horus personally. From there, the hope was that the Emperor would kill Horus, or barring that, die in the attempt. And only here do we start seeing the possibility of the Emperor ascending as some kind of entity of the warp. You see, here, he starts venturing towards Horus in the Vengeful Spirit and drawing in more and more of the warp's power to him, whereupon he very nearly ascends to become a fifth Chaos God called the Dark King. During this time, he would also jettison his empathy and the human feeling part of himself into the warp so that he could get rid of it, which would allow him to actually have the strength needed to kill Horus and then embark on the vicious campaigns of retribution across the galaxy that he knew he would have to undertake to basically regain control of the Imperium. And it is heavily implied, again, cold confirmation, that this part of him will eventually metastasize as people's belief in him begins to mount in the future into being what is known as Starchild, possibly another kind of warp entity that would be like a very hopeful thing for humanity. Still though, the Grey Knights could never have known about that. This possibility of the Emperor becoming the Dark King or the Starchild was not something that was known to anyone at the time, the Emperor included. So if he did come to realize that was a possibility, how would he actually get a piece of paper with the words written plainly on it to the Grey Knights on Titan? You see, he does issue one final command, but that is through the form of tarot card impressions to those in the Vengeful Spirit throne room when they find him near death after killing Horus. So, simply put, the Emperor would have never thought to give them such a directive at the time when they were created. And when this possibility became in some ways apparent, he would have been unable to communicate with them, both because he was indisposed and because they were in the warp on Titan and wouldn't re-emerge until around the time of the second founding, all of which is covered in the End and the Death books, as well as the book The Buried Dagger. And furthermore, we've already been very heavily teased as to what the Terminus Decree could be, a phage that would kill all transhumans in the galaxy. And I know some people found the idea of the Terminus Decree just being a virus to kill all Space Marines a bit disappointing, especially since they wanted it to remain a mystery that could be speculated about and hinted at. But if you're gonna make something that secretive known, or at least heavily imply what it is, the best way to do it would be in a momentous few books like The End and the Death 1, 2, and 3, not as some weird text box footnote in a codex. Like, imagine if there was just a blurb in the corner of a page in one of the codexes for, the Custodes that said, oh yeah, just a heads up, the Emperor is an old one in disguise and has been the entire time. The End and the Death Volume 3 came out a year and a half ago, so it genuinely does seem like whoever wrote this lore piece didn't read it. And furthermore, let's accept it for what it is because, well, it's here, we can't do anything about it. How exactly would this work in any capacity? I've made clear that the Grey Knights are not that fearsome. If anything, they're a cadre of blunderers who have basically screwed up everything they've been involved with. The only time they did anything interesting was to stop Mortarion, with Kaldor Drago carving his name on Mortarion's heart, and everyone hated that too. It just felt so weird and out of place. And that, by the way, is their only really notable named character, Kaldor Drago. There's a few kicking around like Hyperion, but seriously, is he anybody? Like, I know he's the powerful psyker Zale's Eternity, but still, he's not really that notable. I mean, the last time anyone read about him was in the book The Emperor's Gift by Aaron Dembski Bowden, and that is old. Well, who else is there? There is Grandmaster Joros, but wait a minute, he's dead. And yeah, that's the thing. The Grey Knights couldn't even stand up to the Space Wolves, let alone the Custodian Guard. You see, there are 1,000 Grey Knights, because they were in essence the first chapter ever created. And you expect them to go up against the 10,000? 10,000 Custodians, where one Custodian is generally assumed to be, at minimum, worth like 10 to 15 Space Marines. Let's say the Grey Knights are the absolute pinnacle of what a Space Marine is. You could be, if you're being super generous, say that like 3 Grey Knights can kill 1 Custodian. Still, those numbers are insane. And it should be noted, Custodians are literally designed to kill Space Marines. It is their like biological prey. This is directly covered in the Watchers of the Throne books. However, I would like to state the Grey Knights do have advantages that regular Space Marines don't. That being, all Grey Knights are very powerful psychers, and they are willing to do things like use demon weapons and straight up summon demons. They literally did it to stop the Conqueror's engines, so they will do so again. Plus, the Imperial Palace has been infiltrated before. Namely, some of the fallen Dark Angels led by the Lord Cypher almost made it all the way to the throne room, and that was only just a small group of them, before one Custodian approached Cypher and told him it was not yet time. However, those fallen angels were already in a cell on Terra itself, and were able to get loose when the second battle for Terra occurred, when demons would flood the planet and cults would start uprising en masse because of the opening of the Great Rift. Only then were they able to get that far, and even then, only Cypher made it that far. Plus, the Custodians were busy essentially putting down a planet-wide revolt and demonic invasion. So for the Grey Knights to actually pull that off, they would have to sneak all of the Grey Knights onto Terra, get them into position, and then somehow trigger a full planetary demonic invasion. But here's the thing, they won't even be able to do that because of the presence of the Anathema Psychana, aka the Sisters of Silence. You see, the Sisters of Silence were not present during the first battle for Terra in any significant number. Their order had been allowed to deteriorate and basically rot away ever since the end of the Horus Heresy, and the only Sisters of Silence that were still active were ones in isolated outposts throughout the galaxy, basically doing their own thing on their own initiative because the Imperium had forgotten them, as well as those operating the Black Ships. Those were the only ones still really officially working for the Imperium. However, ever since Guilliman returned after the battle for Terra, he would go to great lengths to have all the Sisters of Silence around the galaxy brought together on Terra, and have their fortress monastery on Luna rebuilt, restocked, and refurbished, eventually gathering a force of around 3,000, with many more on the way as he began to ramp up recruitment, finally bringing them back properly into the fold of the Imperium's forces. Not only will the reinvigorated and increasingly numerous Sisters of Silence hamper any demonic activity on Terra and stop any of the Grey Knights' demonic quote-unquote allies, it would also stop them from fighting effectively, because that doesn't just shut down their psychic abilities, it causes them a lot of pain and can even kill them if there is too much contact with the Null Sisters of Silence. We saw this during the invasion of Prospero. Not to mention the fact that Terra is the most heavily defended planet in the entire galaxy. Orbital defense batteries, in-atmosphere defense platforms, so many guardsmen, secrets, standing armies, night houses, titan legions, everything imaginable is concentrated on Terra. This world is nigh on unassailable from the mortal realm. Horus brought half of the galaxy down on Terra's head, and he still failed. You would need access to like the most secretive of secretive knowledge to ever even have a hope of getting anywhere near the Emperor if you were in the position of the Grey Knights, and we know they don't have that because the Terminus Decree does not give them any instructions or any incantations or any information on how to fulfill this directive, other than just, that's what you're supposed to do. And how are they even going to get to Terra? They would need to leave the moon of Titan with all their supporting forces, mind you, such as mortal conscripts and aspirants, and even some heavy machinery and their combat servitors, all of which will be absolutely nullified by what Terra has to bear. Bring them from the moon of Titan, past Jupiter, which is a massive shipyard, past Mars itself, all the way to Terra, so you're gonna have to hopefully pray to God that the orbits of Mars and Jupiter happen to be on, like, the other side of the sun at the time. Make it past Luna, into Terra's atmosphere, without somehow getting blown out of the sky. Because when they see the ships of the Grey Knights, the reactions are gonna be, who the hell are these unmarked space marines we have no records of? Or if it's one of the custodians that gets wind of them, what the hell are you guys doing heading for Terra? What's going on right now? Without giving away what they're there to do. Maybe they could set up the procedures and the structures needed to make something like that happen if they had like 500 years to get everything in place. Actually, you know what? Who am I even kidding? They had over 600 years to get one over on Angron and they still flubbed that. And they wouldn't have like 500 years to get everything in order. The Terminus Decree basically states, hey, if the Emperor is about to get off his seat for any reason, be it healed, being it reborn, or being as a new god, you have to get there and make sure it doesn't happen, which would need to happen immediately. Like, 3, 2, 1, go, 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 now, now, now. Like, legitimately, they would have to bum rush the Imperial throne room. You know they have 2 Titans guarding the Eternity Gate, right? And let's say by some miracle, and I mean miracle, they managed to pull all of that off, which they wouldn't. They then have the task of getting the reborn Emperor of Man back onto his torture throne. Good luck. If he is just reborn into some capacity, he's still going to be crazy powerful and nigh unstoppable. If he's reborn into a new form, what are you even going to do then? That thing's probably going to be even worse. And if he is now a warp god, what's even the plan? How do you even do that? Literally, not one single speck of this makes sense, and everyone on Twitter has been mocking this to hell and back. I have never seen this much of a unified cajoling, ribbing, and just mocking in a long time. They actually managed, by some miracle, to unite the Warhammer community around one single thing. That is a feat. It is amazing. One thing people have actually been pointing to is the idea that the Emperor would return as a child, that being the Star Child. But still, that thing would be like a glowing, radiant child who, again, would be incredibly powerful and would be the most guarded entity in the entire galaxy. Good luck. I do want to ask the question, though, why would the Emperor even give this directive? And I think it's because the Emperor probably fears his own power. Let's say, for example, and this is a big if here, the Emperor was able to issue this decree somehow after being brought to the Golden Throne, after experiencing having almost turned into the Dark King, and knowing that he is in fact going to have to go with Plan Y and stay on this throne for God knows how long. Because keep in mind, him giving up the power of the Dark King that would have literally ended the galaxy and the human race was not his idea, and he had to be thoroughly convinced into it by none other than Olanius Persson, who really had to plead with him to actually take that step and give up the power. So he knows that maybe, if he's in a similar position, he might not be dissuaded a second time. So, he has contingencies in place just in case. Furthermore though, what happens if he does get up? Well, assuming Terra itself is not immediately overrun by demons and destroyed by the Talisman of 7 Hammers implanted into the throne, would the Astronomicon go out? As one could imagine, if it did, that would be a huge cause for alarm. And that's because while the Emperor doesn't fully produce the Astronomicon, it should be noted that he's the one who directs and guides it to make sure it's functioning properly. Basically, he's the man at the controls, not necessarily the power source for the Astronomicon. He does power it a fair bit, but the bulk of the power comes from those 10,000 human psychers who are specially trained for an extended period of time to take their place in the Hollow Mountain and will only last a few months in their position. This is the Astra Telepathica, and it should be noted that that is not the same thing as those 1,000 psychers sacrificed every single day to keep the Emperor alive. However, the Astra Telepathica doesn't produce the Astronomicon on its own, and as such, without the Emperor, it would go out. And even the thing blinking out of existence momentarily is a disaster for the Imperium, with millions of lives being lost as warp travel becomes impossible, leaving ships already in transit in the warp to be lost forever. Worse still, when the Great Rift opened after the destruction of Cadia in M41-999, the Astronomicon would be disrupted in an event called the Noctis Aeterna. This is where, across the galaxy, the Astronomicon would become unavailable, on Terra for around 33 solar days, and other parts of the galaxy for decades thereafter. And this was a disaster for the Imperium, so you could imagine why keeping the Astronomicon lit would be something of immediate and utmost import to the Emperor if he knew that it could go out if he got off the seat. But here's the problem. The Emperor used to produce the Astronomicon back when he was not on the seat, even back when he was out there in the galaxy conquering as part of the Great Crusade. You see, he created the Astronomicon at the very tail end of the Unification Wars to channel his immense psychic power and create the beacon, and it stayed lit all the way through the Great Crusade, and he only created the Adeptus Astrotelepathica begrudgingly because he needed to focus psychic efforts on creating the Webway project. So the Emperor, either fully healed or reborn into a new body, likely would still have the psychic power needed to keep the Astronomicon lit. So you can't even make that excuse. Like, one of the only viable reasons for keeping the Emperor on that seat in my mind would have been the Astronomicon, and making sure that the Talisman of Seven Hammers doesn't blow up Terra. But if he gets off the seat, the chair will just detonate instantly and destroy all of Terra. Like, so what would the Grey Knights even have the chance to do? Like, okay, maybe they'll get some kind of psychic heads up, but I've made it clear why acting on that would likely not be feasible for them. And if the Emperor ascends to being a warp deity, then would humanity even need the Astronomicon, provided that deity isn't, you know, the Dark King? Also, how do you get a warp entity to sit in a chair, like, physically? Again, you couldn't even get one over on the Demon Primarch Angron. Like, realistically, nothing about this makes sense. I could keep going on, but to summarize, 1. Why would this directive be given? 2. When and how was this directive given by the Emperor? 3. How would the Grey Knights even get in position to actually make it happen? 4. How would the Grey Knights not be killed by the forces already on Terra who would be opposing them? And 5. Even if they got past every other logistical hurdle, how would they actually see this task completed? Especially since the Terminus Decree is specifically stated to give them no instructions on how to do this. It's actually kind of funny. A common accusation I've seen leveled at people who make 40k memes and YouTube content is that, oh, they don't even read the books. Yeah, well, apparently, neither do the lore writers. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think that there's some hidden genius to the new Terminus Decree, or do you hate it as much as I and everybody else does? Do you have a different angle on this about maybe why you don't like it, or why maybe it's not that bad? As always, I would love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. Please subscribe if you have not already done so. Consider supporting me on Patreon or joining my Discord server linked below to keep up with me and everything I have going on. And until then, I will see you in the next video.